I love smart objects because it's one of the easiest ways to change artwork once you've just created your smart object. So there's few ways of creating them, and let's see how it's done. One of the easiest ways, especially in a template that is pretty square on and you can kind of see where the card is, you can go ahead and grab your rectangle tool, and in my case it's right here on the bottom. Sometimes if you don't have an extended toolbar, you might have to look for where it has this little tiny square on the bottom thing. Right click it and it will show you all the tools that are hiding. Just a housekeeping tip, I am working on a PC. Also, I have moved my toolbars to the right as I have my right hand as a dominant hand, and I find this easier to work with. If by any chance you do not see one of the tools here, there's this 3 dots. It says edit toolbar, and any of the shapes that are not active on the toolbar, you can kind of drag over to this side. So you can just like grab a tool and bring it over, but we're gonna go ahead and leave them here. So we will grab a rectangle tool. Now, in my case, my rectangle tool says it has no fill, it just has a stroke, and that's not what I want. I'm gonna go ahead and have no stroke, but I will have a fill color. When you're working with smart objects, because you're gonna be changing contents of your smart object, it does not matter what color it is. And now we're gonna go ahead and draw a rectangle that is as close to this card as possible. So this was photographed as a 5x7 card. However, if you have a specific card you're placing, we're gonna address it in a moment. So for this, I'm gonna draw a 5x7, and we're gonna go ahead and try and drag it in as close as it is to the card. So we can also preserve certain things that exist in a photograph, like naturally occurring shadows. So this looks pretty good. In this case, if we look here on the bottom, you will see this square that has these dots. And this is because we use the shape tool and it is still an active shape. So you can adjust the shape by changing corners. I want to rasterize it and make it a flat layer. And for that, we're going to go ahead here, hovering above the where the text is, right clicking it, and we will go ahead and rasterize it. Our next step is going to make this shape into a smart object. So we're going to go ahead and click on it. And if you, I want to show you a few things. If you click on a square, it's going to give you a different pop-up. So you will see there's different options you can do. You want to be above the text or this empty area, and right click on it. That will give you options, and we want to convert it to smart object. And now you see in this tiny corner this icon. The smart object is not being damaged if you resize it or you move it. To access the contents of this object, we will double click on this little thing. I know that I freehanded this square close to the paper, and that might be an issue because my cards are 5x7 and I want to make sure that that this object's actually 5x7. So we will recrop it here when we are inside the contents. Now I want to make sure that my constraint is 5x7. I want it to be horizontal, not vertical, so we're going to go ahead and flip it. If you see here on the bottom, the way I'm accessing this is I'm on the crop tool on the right here on the toolbox, and when I'm inside of the crop tool, I will have access to cropping options. It may be defaulted to width by height ratio with the resolution. It could be just a ratio. So in this case, I want it to be 5x7. I can go back to width and height and make sure that it's a 300 dpi. My main thing is that it's 5x7. And 5x7 essentially by default is vertical, but you can go ahead and use these arrows and make it horizontal. So let's hit enter, and it's gonna recrop it to the proper ratio. So now that I have cropped it to 5:7, I know this is how my artwork is gonna be final. We're gonna go ahead and hit Control S, save it, and close it. So now my final square here is a 5:7 ratio and accurate to a card. We're gonna go ahead and do a few things to make this card look more realistic instead of this little pasted over square. We will go ahead and duplicate the layers. On the bottom layer, so we're gonna go drop to the bottom layer. This layer is going to give us a slight blur, and the way we're gonna accomplish that is gonna go to filter, blur, Gaussian blur. We're gonna go ahead to the corner, and you can see how it creates a blur. If you want to see it closer, depending on your resolution of your photograph that you're working in, zoom in close. You will have still your crisp layer on top, and you want to kind of keep it visible. But then you're gonna go filter, blur, Gaussian blur. And you can see how it gives that just slight blurriness to it, and it adds a little bit of realism because nothing's super crisp. It's not just a crisp pixel. So if you look here, it looks fairly blurry. I might just adjust it slightly to maybe 4.5. This number is really subjective because it depends on how big your photograph is that you're working with. If it's smaller resolution, it may be smaller radius, and if it's a high resolution, it may be hovering somewhere around 4 or 5 or 6. So let's hit OK, and I'm gonna show you, if you remove the top crisp layer, you can see how it is slightly blurry. But the magic of these smart objects is once you duplicate it, it's linked. So if I change, it's this magic envelope, and I said take this artwork from this same envelope, because I just duplicated my layers, and I want you to take all the information out from the same source. So the next thing that we're gonna do to add realism is we're gonna add a drop shadow. In this case, if you look at these other things, and we can try to analyze where the lighting was, and it looks like a dominant light was coming from this bottom right corner. So the shadow is in this direction. You can see it in the ornaments, and you can see it in the branches. So we will want to add a drop shadow to the layers. You can do it for either one of the layers. I'm gonna go ahead and do it on the bottom layer that already has a Gaussian blur. So we will go ahead and select that layer, go on the bottom with this FX button, click on it and hit drop shadow. Now to create a drop shadow, by default you probably will be on the multiply. I like to see where I'm working, so we're gonna go ahead and push that opacity pretty high. Now I know that my drop shadow should be going upwards, so just about where it was. I've worked with this file before, so it's by default, but if you look, there's a little cheat on this square, and you can see where the shadow is going. So we're gonna go ahead, bring it up, and once I figure it out where I like it, I'm gonna bring the opacity down, but we're gonna adjust some of these other things. And so some of these things are distance of how far from the object the shadow's falling. Now we're looking here, it is falling a little bit of a way, so I like it a little bit outwards. Spread is kind of like how harsh it spreads out, so it's how close the light source is, and I'm gonna leave that spread pretty low. And then the size, it also kind of works with hardness of the shadow. I want it still pretty soft, so I'm just gonna move it right on here. And now we see where that shadow is. I want to reduce the opacity. As you can see, it is not very distinct, so I want to have that opacity quite light. However, I still want it to be visible. I'd reduce the distance slightly. And here we go. Now don't worry if you click save and you're like, no, this shadow does not look right. The beauty of doing stuff with smart objects, these are called smart filters. So you can see where we use drop shadow, we can double click it and we can rework all the settings. Actually, the same thing applies to the blur. So we can double click on the blur and go to the corner and rechange it. Which in blur case, you would not be able to do it if it's a raster file and if it is not a smart object. So now the next thing that you want to do is replace contents. There are a few ways to update the smart object. One of the easiest ways is by double clicking onto the object, File, Place Embedded, select your final file, make sure that it is covering all the original rectangle. You can also turn it off or delete it, Control Save. So you're gonna go ahead and save this, and once we close this, it has updated in a file. In this case, it's gonna give you the closest to the resolution. And the reason I'm showing you to do it this way is if you have that rectangle in that envelope, in that smart object saved, and it has a different resolution than the file you're replacing it with, it will replace that resolution because it's trying to preserve the integrity of the file. So let's look at it the other way. So the other option would be to right click, replace contents, and click on the file. And I don't know if you noticed, the file just became a little bit bigger. It's obstructing. So if we look here, it's obstructing some of the ornament. It's obstructing more of the things. It has to do with the size of the file and the resolution of the file compared to the square that we created. This is not wrong. This is not a wrong way to create it, but it's one of the things that can happen. So that's why I was showing you the other way, where you double click on smart object icon, place it here, enter, save it. And once we close it, now it has updated true to size. And this will also apply if you've ever purchased a file from a third party, from something like Creative Market or somebody on Etsy, and now you have this smart object and you're trying to paste in your artwork and it's either super tiny or it's bigger and you're trying to figure out what is happening. It is a resolution problem, and the easiest way to solve it is, instead of clicking replace contents here, by actually pasting artwork into the smart object by double clicking the smart object folder. Now I will show you another way of creating a smart object, and if you are constantly working with same resolution files, same samples, it will help you immensely. And that is by not creating a square, but by actually dragging your artwork on top. So we're going to go ahead and hit File, Place Embedded, and now we're placing this artwork right away. So we have placed it slightly bigger. We can adjust it how we want it. So we're going to go ahead and bring it as close as we can to the original paper size and hit enter. And if you noticed when you hit File, Place Embedded, this file automatically became a smart object. Now we would want to do the same thing we did with a square, is duplicate it, have the bottom layer slightly blurry, filter, blur, Gaussian blur. So we don't worry about how blurry the face is gonna look because it's a layer below the main layer. As you can see, this hasn't changed, but we're looking at this edge and it looks like it's a little too blurry for me. So in this case, I'm just gonna go ahead down to like maybe 3.8. We also want to add that drop shadow. So we're gonna go ahead on that bottom layer, select FX, drop shadow, and kind of adjust again. The shadow has preserved it from our last editing, so looks pretty good to me. Maybe slightly less opacity. Hit OK, and it looks pretty good. If you are replacing it with different artwork, and for those who work with the same printing partner, we use same templates over and over again. We're gonna double click on this and we can file, place embedded, create new artwork. So what you will see sometimes is there will be a pop-up like this. If I hit save, it will tell me can't save this document back to its original file format, flatten layers, and discard extra data. It happens occasionally, and I really don't know why, but in that case, I would select both layers and flatten them. You can go ahead into your layers and it will say merge layers, so just right on the bottom. And then once you are save it now, and you can see that it still preserved the drop shadow and it preserved the slight blurriness, so we can see that both layers are working the same. I would encourage you to have these kind of templates. Once you create them, save them as an extra file and work on a copy in case you move something or you get confused or you delete a layer accidentally, that you can go ahead and have a default file that is ready. But if you're working with the same size templates, as I mentioned before, like if you're working with the same printing partner and you're always working at 5x7s and you're creating 72 DPI files for online viewing, you can just go to right-clicking on text where the smart object is, replace contents, and it will match to the size that the template was created. So I'm hoping that this helps. We're gonna do a quick look at it for artwork. It has all of the same principles. In this case, I created I took a room. When you're creating it from a file like this is a blank room, look where the lighting is, look where the shadow is. So in this case, I will pretend that I need my frame above this window light. So we're gonna go ahead, I have it already created. Some of the principles apply the same, and I'm gonna show you a slight variation. So I wanted to go and create an artwork that would be framed on this white background. A few things to consider is if it overlaps this lighting, I would have to create this effect also on the artwork, which can be done, but for this purpose, we won't do it. So I'm gonna go ahead and create a frame, and I will do it by using a shape tool. Again, here on the bottom, we're gonna use the square, and I'm gonna go ahead and create a shape tool. And actually, I think I'm gonna have it wider. Now, these things can be done precisely, and they can be done with creating, looking at the pixel dimensions and ratios, for example, for a looking for specific frames. So let's say if you're working in standard sizes like 8 by 10 or 14 by 20, or squares like 40 by 40, you would create it according to the artwork. So for this artwork, I'm imagining that I am having a frame, and I'm gonna have my artwork matted inside of this frame. So for the frame, I am going to, if I'm working on with a shape tool, so I'm selected on the shape, I'm gonna go and click into it, and now we have properties for it. I do want to have a stroke, and for this stroke I want it to be black. I want it to have a black frame. I'm imagining a black frame. So for this size, does not look like that frame is really appropriate. So we're gonna double click again on this square. It is telling me it's 1 pixel, and I'm thinking it should probably be more than that. So let's call it 20 pixels. And then it still looks like it's kind of pasted on top of it. And what we want to do is create a little bit of drop shadow to match the surroundings. So we're gonna go ahead, create a drop shadow, and in this case, the light's coming from top right area. We can see how our drop shadow is looking right here on the bottom. This time we will want to have the distance a little bit further. It looks like this is where the light's going. Still kind of very soft, and I'm going to reduce the opacity quite a bit. In this case, we can actually remove fill. Once we have the frame, I see where the shadow is falling. Right now, we're gonna work on the next layer, which will be the matting. But since this is an active shape layer, sometimes it is a little bit harder to edit, so we're gonna go ahead and lock it. And there's this tiny little lock on the bottom above layers, and we're gonna go ahead and click right on it. Now I want to go ahead and create a matte. I do not want any stroke on it, so we're gonna go and remove the stroke. And I want to have a white fill, so I'm gonna have white matting, maybe just a slight tint to it. I'm ready to have the mask for the artwork. I'm gonna go ahead and create another rectangle. I'm imagining it to be in the middle, and I still want slight shadow on it. Maybe not as much as the one below, but I still want to show dimension. And so I'm gonna go ahead and make the distance to be way smaller, make the spread to be smaller, but this is where I'm imagining my art is going to be. It is a shape object, and because of that, you can adjust its size. And shadow is kind of following where it's dropping off. In this case, I wouldn't use the smart object, but I would use a clipping mask. And so if I go ahead and hit File, Place Embedded, let's put this one, even though it's a vertical. I'm gonna resize it to this size. And once I hit enter, it is a smart object, but I would not really worry about replacing artwork here. I would right click on where the lettering is and create a clipping mask. And so now I have artwork that is clipped to the square below. So this is another way of creating a template. So The way you would use template in this case is that if I decide to replace artwork from a different file, I can go ahead and hit File, Place Embedded, go ahead and go to Artwork and place another artwork in it. And two ways of adjusting it is you can drag it under the existing clipped artwork and it will automatically clip it and then just turn off the layer for the other one, or you can have it by right clicking it and creating a clipping mask, and that is how you would do artwork. Hope this helps.